Hello, welcome back. Recasting is an effective way to correct a student. Some teachers like it and others don't. I'm in the first group. So the student says, "Yesterday I go at the park." There's two mistakes there. The teacher recasts correctly what the student should have said. You went to the park yesterday. And the student repeats. But look, they've only corrected one error, the preposition. Now there's positives and negatives to this approach. It is a relaxed, informal way to correct the student. It doesn't interrupt the conversation like a correction slot. It's just on the spot. The rest of the students listening can pick up on the correction. And with adults it works very well because they're aware of what you're doing and they respond. However, most recasts are ignored. Like in the example above, the student didn't correct the past tense. With younger learners, it often doesn't work because they're not aware of what you're doing. If the student makes multiple errors, like in the example above, then if the teacher corrects all of the errors, it can just lead to overload. Students get frustrated because they're talking and they're being interrupted constantly by recasts. Many cultures expect to be corrected overtly on the spot. For example, the student might say, "Yesterday I go at the park." Many cultures want the teacher to say, "No, you made two mistakes there. Yesterday I went to the park." I like recasting, but be aware and use it judiciously. So who should be doing the thinking for the students? The students or you? Professor Dylan Williams here. He's an authority on feedback and correction. And he says that the students have to do the main part of the work, finding their own errors with only guidance and prompting from the teacher. Rewriting text, listening to feedback before performing a dialogue again. Now teachers can't correct every mistake, there's far too many of them. Instead we've got to make the students aware of the mistakes that they usually make and train them to edit their own writing and speaking, finding their own errors or each other's errors along the journey. The student has to do the thinking, not the teacher. It's no good testing a student and then giving them the correct answers. Much better that we test them and then train them to correct their own mistakes. Finally, don't confuse feedback with praise. The purpose of feedback is to prompt the students to ask themselves questions. Why is this wrong? What's the best way? How do I find the solution? Active students are those who are thinking, being creative, solving their own problems, and also thinking about the way they think, learning about how they learn, being involved in the process. Passive students just sit and receive the knowledge that the teacher wants to present. This makes for a very, very teacher-centered lesson, and this isn't what we want. A student who's cognitively engaged doesn't just ask the teacher for the answer. He looks for ways to find the answer himself. This might be reading or listening to feedback, understanding the language through the context that it's in, or having a knowledge of his usual mistakes and being self-aware. This is the student who will improve. We're not here to teach grammar and vocabulary. No. Rather, we test the students by providing challenges and tasks using language. By solving their own problems, The students have some control and autonomy in their learning, becoming much more motivated. It's more about them, not the teacher. Ultimately, our goal is to encourage the students to use their higher thinking skills. Look at Bloom's taxonomy. When you plan your lessons, each separate stage should include one of the verbs beside this pyramid. One of these verbs here. To critique, to compare and contrast, to investigate, to interpret. I'd like to see this sort of language on all your lesson plans when I come to watch you teach. But more importantly, so would the students. They love to be challenged. Build these thinking skills into your error correction tasks, starting at the bottom of the pyramid. Students can define an error, for example. A spelling error might be when a student writes a word how it sounds. Students can classify their errors in a class brainstorm and then identify the errors by proofreading or listening to each other's output. Students can implement corrections by redrafting writing or rerunning a speaking task. Students can compare and contrast their ideas, select and argue their own opinions, and finally, develop and design their own original work, which is personal to them. If you promote these skills at every stage of your lesson, your students will develop autonomy and start engaging in the lesson in a much more meaningful way. Here's your keyword for this video, butterfly. Make a note of that. There shouldn't be any activity with no feedback. Or what was the point? Here's a few practical ideas to give feedback and correction in class. Try discussing with the class the usual suspects of errors that they make. Brainstorm these errors on the whiteboard, and then encourage students to self-analyse. Why not use the students' smartphones in class? Use the voice recorder to record dialogues and role plays, and then the students can listen in groups and make notes of the errors. They can self-correct and do the task again correctly. Students receive a number of sentences taken from their written work. Some are correct, some are wrong. In groups, students have to try to buy the correct sentences in the auction, and they have a limited amount of money. The team with the most correct sentences wins. The example I've given here, all the sentences are incorrect, and I've even listed the number of mistakes I think there are in the sentence. Mistakes mazes are an interesting idea. This comes from a book, Correction, by Bartram and Walton Thompson Heinley. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Students have a numbered list of sentences, and their route through the maze depends on whether the sentences are right or wrong. They follow the white arrows for correct sentences and the black arrows for incorrect sentences. If they've identified all the sentences correctly, then they will escape. If not, they have to retrace their steps and find out where they went wrong. And this analysis at the end leads to self-correction. Allow the students to talk as a class. Stroll around making notes of incorrect sentences, then after the activity, write the sentences on the whiteboard and ask the students to correct the sentences in pairs. Let the students do all of the work, just prompt and encourage. After all the sentences are corrected, ask the students to reconstruct the original dialogue from memory and replay it corrected. Then, again, stroll around, collect mistakes, and then replay the dialogue again, corrected. One of my favourite activities is Dictogloss. It's a real challenge. You've got to give confident, clear instructions for this task. Now here is a text from the Eden Project. We're going to look at just the first sentence here, because that will be more than enough up to this full stop here. Now check out the instructions for the activity on this video. The first sentence in the text above is more than enough for a higher level class. Of course, for an elementary class, you need to pick something much more simple. Individually, the students just listen as you read the first sentence. Experience the sights, smells, and scale of the rainforests in the rainforest biome, the world's largest greenhouse, and discover the tropical plants that are used to produce everyday products. Then, after you say start, they write down what they've heard. Then they put their pencils down and they listen again. After you've read the text a number of times, then put the students into pairs. Don't give them the answers, but ask them to compare what they have written. And then they use what they find to reconstruct the sentence which they think they've heard. After they've achieved this, then put the pairs into groups of 4 and repeat. This way, students correct what they've heard as a group, and finally, give them the text that you'd read and ask them to compare what they have written with the original. Discuss, has the meaning changed? Whichever way you go about correcting your students, try and keep the experience positive for the learner. Being corrected constantly can be really demotivating, as every language learner knows, but there's no point in the students completing a task unless they get some constructive feedback. As you're listening out for your students' errors, then make sure you also listen out for some really good uses of language and highlight these to the groups too. In the case of language learning, I really do believe the classic saying, you learn from your mistakes. Thanks very much for listening.